some states do just a horrible job of maintaining the accuracy of their voter registration rolls. And, Nevada is an example of that.
You're watching Restoring America, where we shine a light on the fundamental values of this country and all the reasons why they're worth saving. This week, we're going to talk about one of voters' biggest concerns heading into next week's election: whether it will be fair. I'm Kaylee McGee-White, and this is Restoring America. Voters' confidence in the integrity of our elections continues to slip, especially in the wake of the 2020 election, when many states adopted looser voting rules to accommodate pandemic restrictions. To be clear, this is not a defense of former President Donald Trump's continued allegations that the 2020 election was stolen from him. But we should at least be willing to wrestle with the reasons why he and so many of his supporters continue to believe that, especially if doing so will bolster trust in the outcome of next week's election as voters head to the polls. One undeniable fact that must be addressed is Democrats' continued efforts to weaken election integrity requirements. At least 15 states, most of them controlled by Democrats, do not require any form of ID to vote. Even more states have bloated voter rolls, meaning there are tens of thousands of voters still registered in those states who are no longer eligible to vote. All of this raises an important question: how secure will the 2024 election be? My guest today is going to help us break all of this down. But before we get to him, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and for more, head to washingtonexaminer.com. With me today is Hans von Spakovsky, a senior legal fellow for the Heritage Foundation and a former commissioner on the Federal Elections Commission. Hans, thanks so much for joining us today. You have written a lot about election integrity and the need for reform in various states. And one of the primary reforms that just makes sense would be voter ID. And yet Democrats in a lot of these Democratic-controlled states are so opposed to this basic reform. Why is that?
Well, I tell you, in some ways, I think it's a patronizing attitude towards their constituents. They mistakenly think that the people who vote for them don't have the ability to get the free ID that every state that actually has an ID requirement, puts in. But unfortunately, I think there are also some political consultants who don't want ID because they think it's going to make it harder to cheat in elections. And so I think it's kind of a combination of the two.
What are some other specific vulnerabilities you foresee happening in November's election? Obviously, every state has its own policies when it comes to managing these elections. But what are some of the particular vulnerabilities you think people should be on the lookout for?
Well, unfortunately, some states do just a horrible job of maintaining the accuracy of their voter registration rolls. And, Nevada is an example of that. There have been plenty of cases showing that they have people registered in vacant lots at casinos, places where clearly people are not living. And yet Nevada switched to a system in which they mail out an absentee ballot to every single registered voter. That means that ballots are going to be showing up all over the place in the state for people who don't actually live where supposedly they claim they live, may even be fictitious. And when you have that many absentee ballots floating around, somebody may say, well, you know what? Why don't I fill all these out and send them in? And when you also don't have an ID requirement, which is, for example, the situation in places like California, Nevada, New York, and elsewhere, it's easy to commit fraud using absentee ballots.
Another issue that struck me this week was a number of secretaries of state from especially some of the blue wall states preemptively coming out and saying they might not be able to get the final election results for days after election day. That seems like a glaring problem, especially with the rise of early voting, which you would think would mitigate some of that problems.
Yeah, no, you're right. But again, that's because of a bad change made by mostly blue states, which is, look, the rule in most states was absentee ballots had to be in the hand of election officials by the end of election day. But many of these states have changed their law to say, well, as long as there is a postmark on the envelope of the absentee ballot by election day, We will continue to accept and count absentee ballots that come in, 5 days after the election, 10 days after the election. And that's the kind of thing that, that is also a recipe for, I think, risky potential behavior with absentee ballots, but also is going to delay counting up the final outcome.
You also have mentioned in a recent piece that there are some signs of hope in some states that legislators are taking seriously the need for reform when it comes to election integrity. What are some of these reforms, and how are some ways that other states can follow suit to build back confidence in the election system?
Yeah, well, you'll recall Georgia was a big state of controversy in the 2020 election. And so their legislature in 2021 passed a huge election reform package. And it did things like, because of the huge increase in mail-in voting that we've been talking about, they took their voter ID law. Georgia had a great law, been in place since 2008, but it only applied to in-person voting. They extended their voter ID law to absentee balloting. That was a very good change that they put in. North Carolina, also a battleground state, they for years have been fighting to get a voter ID law in place against litigation. They finally got one that will be in place for this election. Those are the kind of good changes that ought to be done. North Carolina also recently said, well, we have actually done a lot to clean up our voter registration list. They announced they had taken 750,000 individuals off their voter registration list who were dead or had moved out of the state. And that also is a good way of making sure you've got accurate voter rolls.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this important conversation. We appreciate it. And for more breaking news, conservative views, and exclusive interviews, be sure to check out washingtonexaminer.com.